Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel where we explore narratives that resonate deeply. If you're passionate about empathy, justice, and seeking truth, you've found your community. We often hear that time is a great healer, but what happens when a wound is constantly reopened, in subtle daily ways that most people overlook? Racism isn't always overt. It doesn't always manifest as burning symbols or aggressive slurs. Sometimes it's expressed through a quiet withdrawal, a mischance, or a deliberate silence. Some people ask, haven't we moved past this? Why are we still focused on racism? But others argue, precisely because it's now more covert, it's more insidious than ever. What's your perspective on this? Before we delve into our main story, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your engagement is what allows us to amplify real voices, challenge unspoken truths, and foster honest dialogue. Every single click matters and every story deserves to be heard. Now let's begin. Imagine the quietest person in your town, a gentle librarian with a kind smile and silver hair, possessing proof of a conspiracy so immense it could alter the fate of democracy itself. And what if powerful forces were willing to go to any lengths, absolutely any lengths, to silence her before the truth could surface? In the heart of Savannah, Georgia, where ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss cast shadows over cobbled streets, Clara Johnson had dedicated over 3 decades to the peaceful sanctity of the city library. To the casual observer, she was a model of tranquility, a soft-spoken woman of 62 who greeted every patron with warmth, could recite poetry by heart, and remembered the names of children who returned year after year for new books. But beneath the calm rhythm of her daily existence, Clara was quietly building a movement that would soon challenge the very foundations of authority. Her revolution wasn't a spectacle. It didn't involve marching with banners or shouting through megaphones. It began with simple acts, showing a young person how to register to vote, helping an older couple understand new voter ID requirements, and arranging weekend gatherings where neighbors could share food, music, and information about their civic rights. Voting, Clara would often say, is the pen we all hold to rewrite the story of tomorrow. To her, each signature on a registration form was a small triumph, a thread woven into a larger tapestry of justice that she had been crafting since her parents first shared their stories of the 1960s civil rights marches. However, as her work expanded across Savannah's Black communities, something else began to emerge: unnamed shadows. Cars with tinted windows began to linger near church parking lots where she held her events. Flyers promoting her workshops mysteriously vanished overnight. Pastors who had previously welcomed her started receiving anonymous warnings that their churches could be subject to sudden safety inspections if they continued to host her gatherings. Clara, ever cautious, began to document every incident in a leather-bound journal she kept concealed beneath the circulation desk, writing late at night as if leaving a trail of breadcrumbs for someone who might one day need to follow. Her activism was never born of rage. It was born of fortitude. Still, there were nights when, alone in her modest apartment, she would compose letters to her late husband, James, folding them within the pages of her journal to confide her fears. "I sense it, James," one letter read. "Something much larger than us is operating in the shadows. It's not just an angry individual or an overzealous official. It feels coordinated. And if I am to disappear, someone must know why I persisted." Clara could never have imagined those words would soon become the most important she had ever written. For now, she continued her work, driven by a force deeper than fear, the unwavering belief that knowledge and courage would outlast intimidation. And all the while, forces far beyond Savannah were starting to take notice. They weren't just irritated by her efforts, they felt endangered. Her meticulous spreadsheets of new voters, her expanding network of volunteers, her steadfast presence, all of these posed a threat to a plan years in the making. A plan that stretched far beyond Georgia's borders. A plan whose architects had no intention of letting one silver-haired librarian impede their progress. Unbeknownst to Clara, she was not truly alone. Hundreds of miles away, a son who had built his life on disciplined silence and a deep faith in the system would soon find his world turned upside down by a single phone call. Before the week was over, Clara Johnson's quiet revolution would spark a firestorm that neither Savannah nor the nation would ever forget. What would you do if, during a routine call with your mother, you realized her voice wasn't the only one on the line, that someone with a mix of authority and malice was making her a target? Would you maintain your position or risk everything to uncover the truth? At Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Colonel Elias Johnson's life was defined by a code honed through years of service and sacrifice. His days were a testament to order. The early morning jogs through the mist, the precise delivery of his briefings, the silent discipline of his Special Operations Unit. To most who knew him, Elias was the very image of control. A man who never allowed emotion to cloud his judgment, who had unshakable faith in the integrity of institutions and the sanctity of his oath. But all of that began to change with one phone call. It was a Sunday night, his designated time to call Clara. The one moment in his week when the burden of his duty felt a little lighter. Her voice always held a warmth that made the sterile reality of military life seem less oppressive. That evening, however, her voice was shaky, not with fear, but with the careful restraint of someone aware they are being watched. Elias could hear a second voice in the background, sharp and terse, demanding identification and questioning her presence near a row of brownstone houses. Clara's responses were calm and measured, as if she had rehearsed this scenario. "I'm on my way home. I live here. My materials are for a voter education drive," she explained. Then came the words that made Elias grip his phone tighter. "People like you don't belong lingering here. We've had reports." The officer's tone was inflexible, laced with a familiar prejudice that Elias instantly recognized, the kind that assumes its subject will simply retreat. Clara, maintaining her dignity, simply restated the facts. "I have walked this route for 20 years. My home is 5 blocks from here." The line fell silent for a moment, punctuated only by the sound of shuffling papers. Clara's breathing was even, but Elias could detect something else beneath it. A sharp exhaustion she would never voice. Then just as abruptly the call ended. No explanation, no goodbye. The silence on the line was heavier than any battlefield Elias had ever stood on. He stared at his phone long after the screen went dark. A multitude of instincts pulled at him simultaneously. The soldier's impulse to gather facts, the son's instinct to protect, and something deeper, a quiet rage he had long suppressed. Throughout his career, Elias had faced his own silent battles. The subtly raised eyebrows at his promotions, the coded remarks that questioned his leadership, the whispered doubts about whether someone who looked like him belonged in the highest echelons of power. He had persevered by believing that his superior performance would ultimately conquer their bias. But this wasn't about him. This was about his mother. That night, Elias sat alone in his quarters, the harsh light of his desk lamp casting long shadows over his hands as he opened a secure communications channel. He didn't mention Clara's name or voter registration drives. Not yet. Instead, he sent out 3 messages to the people he trusted most in the world. The first went to General Henry Whitmore, a mentor who had seen Elias's potential before anyone else and had never ignored injustice, even within their own ranks. The second was sent to Captain Layla Brooks, his unit's cybersecurity expert, whose ability to trace digital footprints had saved American lives abroad. The third message was for Agent Naomi Cho, an FBI investigator whose frustration with her agency's reluctance to pursue civil rights cases had often left her feeling isolated. The replies came swiftly, each echoing the same concern. Something is wrong and it isn't a coincidence. Cho had already been monitoring an increase in suspicious activity reports targeting community organizers in several southern states, all connected to vaguely documented complaints from residents. Brooks had intercepted private network chatter hinting at a coordinated effort to stabilize certain districts before the upcoming elections. And Whitmore, cautious but firm, said something that solidified Elias's resolve. "I've seen this pattern before. Different methods, different circumstances. It begins with harassment, then it escalates. You must act before it does." Elias understood the risk of crossing that line. The Posse Comitatus Act had been ingrained in him since his first day in uniform. The military does not interfere in domestic law enforcement. His career and potentially his freedom would be on the line if he made a single misstep. But as he thought about Clara's steady voice, the burden she carried for her community, and the journal she had mentioned weeks ago, the one she was keeping just in case, he realized he could not stand by idly. Not this time. Yet it wasn't anger that propelled him but something sharper. Clarity. If what Clara suspected was true, this wasn't just about her. It was about something woven into the very fabric of the nation. A quiet but deliberate strategy to keep certain voices marginalized. Elias had fought shadow wars overseas, dismantling networks designed to destabilize foreign nations from within. Now for the first time he began to wonder if the same tactics were being employed on American soil. And if so, whether his sworn oath required him to follow the rules or to protect the people. The rules were failing. He turned off his lamp and looked out into the darkness beyond the window. In the distance, the faint sound of aircraft echoed in the Carolina night. Tomorrow he would begin an operation that could end his career. But as he recalled Clara's words, "Voting is how we rewrite tomorrow," he knew there was no other option. The silence on the phone earlier had been a warning, not just for his mother but for the nation itself. And Elias knew that a warning is only useful if you act on it before it is too late. What if the threats Clara sensed weren't random at all, but part of a vast organized web extending far beyond Savannah? A sophisticated system designed to silence voices like hers before they could ever reach the ballot box. The initial clues of Operation Eclipse began to surface in a dimly lit operations room at Fort Bragg, where Elias Johnson, supported by Captain Layla Brooks and Agent Naomi Cho, analyzed a flood of intercepted data. This was no longer just about Clara. What had seemed like isolated incidents of harassment, unmarked vans, cryptic warnings, churches suddenly targeted for inspections, were parts of a pattern that spanned 12 states. When connected, each data point revealed something far more calculated than mere local prejudice. It was a blueprint for disenfranchisement, a plan so meticulously structured it had a code name: Operation Eclipse. At its core was Franklin Cade, a billionaire defense contractor based in Houston, Texas. His public image was impeccable, a man who financed scholarships and veterans programs, celebrated as a true patriot. But hidden beneath his charitable facade was a network of private security firms, data analytics companies and political operatives, all working toward a single objective: to suppress voter turnout in districts with significant black populations. Elias had seen operations like this before in his overseas deployments. The terminology was the same, the framework familiar: stabilize, neutralize, control. Only this time the battlefield was American streets, and the targets were not insurgents but citizens. Cho, whose investigation had been stalled for months by her superiors, finally had the missing context. The reports she had gathered: pastors facing sudden zoning violations, students expelled for minor offenses just before registration deadlines, election offices in black neighborhoods temporarily closed for maintenance, had all been dismissed as local bureaucratic errors. But here they were, linked together by funding streams leading back to Cade's subsidiaries. One shell company after another, each moving money to local officials and private contractors tasked with guaranteeing stability in key precincts before the upcoming elections. Elias felt a cold clarity as the evidence mounted. Clara wasn't just a target because she was prominent. She was targeted because she was effective. Her voter registration drives had subtly altered projections in Savannah's most contested district. Her spreadsheets, meticulously cataloging thousands of new registrants, were not just numbers. They were a threat to the delicate balance that Operation Eclipse was built to preserve. And somewhere in Cade's offices or his offshore servers, her name had been flagged, highlighted, and passed down a chain of command designed to make her work impossible without ever resorting to violence. But what struck Elias most wasn't the sheer scale of the conspiracy. It was its precision. Cade's network had perfected a form of suppression that didn't look like suppression. Instead of outright blocking voters, they created conditions where participating became an ordeal: exhausting, frustrating, or legally risky. Brooks discovered internal memos instructing local operatives to increase friction, closing polling locations under the pretense of safety audits, flooding neighborhoods with misinformation about voting dates, and even coordinating with social media algorithms to amplify fears of election fraud. The tactics were subtle, but their intention was unmistakable. In the basement of the Savannah Library, Clara's journal became their most human piece of evidence. Elias found himself reading her looping handwriting late into the night. It contained stories of the people she had met, voices that had been discouraged or silenced. A young man repeatedly ticketed for minor vehicle infractions until he could no longer afford the fines and feared driving to the polls. A grandmother whose church faced abrupt fire code violations after hosting a registration drive. A college student threatened with disciplinary action for distributing voter information on campus. Clara had recorded it all, not as statistics but as stories, understanding that facts alone rarely stir the heart. If I can't stop it, one entry read, at least someone will know the truth of what we faced. That same night, a community meeting took place in Savannah's east side, which Elias attended in plain clothes. It wasn't a protest or a demonstration. It was a gathering of people seeking solutions, even as the weight of intimidation pressed down on them. Local artists painted murals of open hands holding ballots. Choirs sang freedom songs from the civil rights era, their voices rising above the tension in the streets. Volunteers organized walk-to-vote groups, vowing to escort vulnerable voters to the polls together so that no one would feel isolated. Elias realized then that the essence of the movement wasn't just about exposing the network. It was about strengthening the spirit of the people it sought to suppress. Still, exposure was crucial. Without a spotlight, Operation Eclipse would continue to operate in the shadows, its masterminds free to erase any trace of their work. That's when Elias made the decision that would set everything in motion. With Brooks's cybersecurity expertise, they began to map Cade's digital architecture, tracing financial transactions, intercepting communications between Orion security operatives, and even accessing internal strategy documents that detailed which districts were considered priority stabilization zones. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered. And with each revelation, Elias felt the gravity of his choice weighing on him. Every keystroke, every intercepted call, every file decrypted without authorization pushed him further from the military code he had sworn to uphold. But as he watched a map light up with connections, dots representing communities like Clara's, all linked to a network that viewed American citizens as obstacles to be managed, he knew there was no turning back. In one of their final late-night briefings before the story was to break, Brooks looked at Elias, her voice calm but certain. "You've led missions overseas that prevented coups before they started. Tell me, Colonel, how is this any different?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He looked down at Clara's journal, still open to a page where she had written, "Democracy isn't a given. It's a garden. Neglect it and weeds will take over." He gently closed the journal and met Brooks's gaze. "It's not different," he said at last. "It's just closer to home. And this time we aren't fighting to protect borders. We're fighting to protect the ballot." Outside, the first hints of dawn stretched across the horizon. The storm Clara had felt in whispers was no longer distant. It was here and it was immense. And as the full scope of Operation Eclipse came to light, Elias knew the next step would not only test his loyalty to his oath but would also test the resolve of everyone who still believed in the promise of American democracy. What happens when a city, battered but not broken, decides it will no longer whisper in fear but will instead sing in unity? What happens when thousands of strangers, united by nothing more than a belief in justice, rise together despite every attempt to silence them? The first morning of the demonstrations was unlike anything Savannah had experienced in decades. The air was thick with tension, yet charged with something deeper, a collective will that no barricade or threat could shatter. Centennial Olympic Park in Atlanta, intentionally chosen for its historical significance as a place where the world had once gathered, became the pulsing heart of a movement that refused to be intimidated. By midday, thousands had assembled, traveling from Georgia's low country, from coastal towns in South Carolina, and even from small Alabama communities, where news of Clara Johnson's story had awakened something long dormant. The crowd was not a wave of anger but a swell of determination. Families carried homemade signs that read, "Our voice, our right," while choirs from Savannah's oldest black churches led hymns that rose like anthems over the city skyline. Veterans marched alongside teenagers. Teachers stood shoulder to shoulder with business owners, and strangers became allies as they formed human chains to keep the space peaceful and safe. Even as rows of police officers established perimeters around the park, there was no chaos, only a sense of collective, defiant tranquility. Clara herself could not be there in person. The exhaustion and strain of recent weeks had taken a physical toll. Yet, through a live video feed projected onto a huge screen, her face appeared to the assembly as the sun began to set behind the skyscrapers. Her voice, gentle but firm, carried across the square. "I know what it feels like to be made to feel small," she said. "To be told that your voice is insignificant, that your efforts will be undone by those with more power and louder platforms. But I also know this. When a community decides to rise, to stand together, to face the storm side by side, There is no force strong enough to erase its will. This is not about anger. This is about love. For the future we refuse to surrender. Her words were met with silence at first as their meaning sank in, and then with applause that seemed to roll outward like a steady drumbeat. For many present, this was not merely a protest. It was a reclamation of something they feared they had lost, the belief that their voices could still shape the nation's direction. Yet beyond the chants and gospel songs, the tension with local and state authorities simmered. Governor Alan Mercer, under pressure from allies connected to Franklin Cade, had authorized a heavy security presence, framing it as a necessary measure for maintaining public order. Rows of state troopers stood impassively, their shields glinting in the streetlights, their presence an implicit warning of how quickly the state could move from observer to enforcer. But not all officials sided with Mercer's stance. Julian Cross, the mayor of Atlanta, entered the square himself, walking unprotected through the crowd to address the gathering. His voice conveyed the weariness of a man torn between political expectations and moral obligation. "I will not see this city turned into a battleground," he declared. "You have a right to assemble, a right to speak, and a right to be heard. And this city will not be the one to silence you." His presence and his vow to use city resources to protect demonstrators rather than disperse them marked a turning point. Among the crowd, Elias Johnson moved quietly, dressed in civilian clothes, observing and listening. These were not professional agitators or activists. These were ordinary people. A teacher holding her daughter's hand, a retired nurse with a sign that simply said, "Let me vote," a single father telling a local reporter how he had been removed from the voter rolls twice in 2 years, despite never moving. Every conversation Elias overheard highlighted what was truly at stake. This wasn't just about policy, it was about dignity. As night fell, the demonstrations shifted from rallies to vigils. Candles illuminated the square, and the choir's songs softened into quiet harmonies. For a moment, the tension dissolved, replaced by something almost sacred, a shared understanding that what united them was not rage but hope. Behind the scenes, Elias worked with Captain Layla Brooks and Agent Naomi Cho to ensure the protest remained both safe and effective. Through secure channels, Brooks monitored communications suggesting attempts to infiltrate the demonstration with provocateurs, hired agitators designed to incite violence and justify a crackdown. Elias issued a clear command: identify, isolate, and expose. No one here will be framed for violence they didn't initiate. While people in the square held candles and sang, Elias and his team were working to disarm the traps being set against them. They intercepted messages instructing agitators to target businesses near the park, gathered video evidence of undercover operatives trying to provoke scuffles, and provided it all to sympathetic journalists like Maria Santiago, who broadcast the truth in real time. By the time state officials tried to portray the gathering as volatile, the footage had already reached millions online, showing nothing but peaceful solidarity and the deliberate sabotage meant to discredit it. Throughout the night, Clara's words echoed in conversations, repeated by strangers as mantras to steady themselves. Justice, not vengeance. Courage, not chaos. Love for the future. Her message became a kind of shield, a reminder that this was not just about one city or one woman, but about a principle too fundamental to be compromised. By dawn, the demonstrations had grown rather than diminished. What began as thousands was now tens of thousands, joined by faith leaders, civil rights historians, and even small business owners from across the state. The media, unable to ignore the sheer scale and discipline of the movement, changed its narrative, no longer calling it a protest, but a landmark moment of civic awakening. In those quiet hours before the city stirred to life, Elias stood at the edge of the park, watching a new day begin. The rising sun painted the skyline in gold, casting long shadows that seemed to retreat from the light. He thought of Clara, resting at home with her journal beside her bed, unaware of how her quiet perseverance had become a beacon. The people had risen not with fists but with voices, not to tear down but to demand. And for the first time in weeks, Elias allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. They were no longer isolated dots on a map, scattered and easy to suppress. They were a chorus. And a chorus, once it finds its harmony, is impossible to silence. What does victory look like when it's not just about winning a battle but about rebuilding the very trust that was broken? What happens when a quiet librarian's stance not only exposes a conspiracy but also fundamentally reshapes how a nation protects its most sacred right? The turning point arrived not with the sound of chants or the sight of banners, but with the quiet authority of the Department of Justice's arrival in Savannah. Deputy Attorney General Vanessa Green, a woman with a calm demeanor and a record of prosecuting civil rights cases others considered too risky to touch, arrived with a federal task force and a clear mandate: dismantle every part of Franklin Cade's network and hold accountable every official who had exchanged their oath for influence. Her presence transformed the atmosphere in the city. It was no longer simply a grassroots struggle, no longer a movement shouting from the margins. It had become a national reckoning. Over several weeks, the investigation stripped away layer after layer of the machinery behind Operation Eclipse. Shell companies were exposed. Political operatives were subpoenaed, and local officials who had once been untouchable were photographed in handcuffs. Franklin Cade himself, once praised as a benefactor of veterans and education, was escorted into a federal courtroom, flanked by marshals, his empire of influence crumbling as documents and digital evidence traced every dollar he had funneled into voter suppression efforts. For many, watching Cade face justice was a moment of release. But Vanessa Green knew the work was only just beginning. As she reminded her team, their purpose was not merely to punish the guilty. It was to restore what they had tried to take away. Clara Johnson, still recovering her strength, was asked to testify before Congress. She came not as a victim but as a witness, her voice carrying the weight of the countless stories she had chronicled in her journal. Under the bright lights of the hearing room, she spoke with the same quiet composure that had once greeted visitors to her library. "I did not seek this role," she told the committee. "But I could not turn away from what I witnessed. These were not accidents. These were not misunderstandings. They were choices. Choices designed to make people like me and those I serve feel invisible in their own democracy. I am here to remind you that we are not invisible. We never were." Her words, delivered without bitterness, resonated more deeply than any news headline could. They were a powerful reminder of the human core beneath the legal and political turmoil. The hearings paved the way for sweeping reforms. A bipartisan coalition, spurred by the irrefutable evidence presented by Green's team and amplified by journalists like Maria Santiago, passed legislation that established independent oversight commissions for voter access, prohibited law enforcement from interfering in nonpartisan civic activities, and introduced strict penalties for private contractors involved in voter suppression. For the first time in decades, a structural shift was put in place, designed not just to react to injustice but to prevent it. Yet perhaps the most lasting legacy came not from Washington but from Savannah itself. Clara, with Elias at her side, launched the Johnson Center for Civic Empowerment. What started as a small effort to provide legal assistance to voters quickly evolved into a national network, offering everything from free legal defense for those wrongly targeted to training programs for young leaders who wanted to organize their own communities without fear. The center also introduced an innovative concept: mobile civic units, brightly decorated buses that traveled to rural and underserved neighborhoods, providing on-the-spot voter registration, civic education workshops and legal consultations. Each bus displayed Clara's quiet motto, written in elegant script along its side: "Every voice, every vote, every future." Elias, having officially retired from military service, took on a new role within the center, overseeing digital security and education programs. His expertise in tracking and dismantling complex networks now protected citizens from online disinformation and surveillance. He trained volunteers to identify and combat tactics designed to undermine trust in elections, ensuring that the skills he had once used abroad now safeguarded his own countrymen. Although he had been disciplined by military leadership for acting outside official protocols, his decision felt justified when he saw ordinary people, teachers, small business owners, retirees, stand taller, knowing they had the resources to defend their rights. The next election served as a powerful testament to what had been built from the wreckage of Operation Eclipse. Clara, her movements slower but her resolve unbroken, walked to her polling station with a line of neighbors by her side, some of whom had registered to vote for the first time thanks to her foundation's work. Cameras captured the moment as she emerged, her ballot cast, sunlight catching the edges of her silver hair. The crowd that had gathered erupted in applause, not because one vote would change the world, but because her presence symbolized something greater. That the system designed to silence her had failed and her voice, multiplied by thousands, would now resonate where it mattered most. Later that evening, standing on the steps of the Johnson Center, Clara addressed a gathering of volunteers and community members. Her voice carried gently across the quiet night. They tried to make us believe our voices were small, that our votes were worthless, that our place in this democracy was conditional. But here we stand, not just counted but united. They tried to scatter us, but we linked arms. They tried to intimidate us, but we chose courage over fear. And today, with every ballot cast, we prove that no conspiracy, no network, no billionaire can erase the will of a people who refuse to be silent. Her words were shared across the nation in news reports, classrooms, and living rooms. Clara Johnson never sought the spotlight, but her journey from the peaceful stacks of a Savannah library to the halls of Congress had become a modern fable. A reminder that the strength of a democracy resides not just in its institutions, but in the hearts of its people. The legacy she and Elias forged wasn't simply about exposing a single operation. It was about fortifying the belief that ordinary citizens, armed with truth and perseverance, could shape the future. And as Savannah settled into a new season, with the Johnson Center's buses heading to their next destinations and new volunteers stepping forward to continue the work, Clara sat by her window one evening, pen in hand, journal open. Her latest entry was not about fear or uncertainty, but about hope. "The storm has passed for now," she wrote, "but the work is never done. Democracy isn't a handed-down gift. It's a song we must continue to sing no matter how many try to drown it out. And if there is one thing I have learned, it is this. When enough voices rise, they create a harmony that no force can silence." From the quiet shelves of a Savannah library to the halls of Congress, Clara Johnson's journey became more than a personal struggle. It became a powerful symbol of what can happen when resilience meets purpose. Clara, a 62-year-old librarian who had devoted her life to community service and education, never imagined she would find herself at the center of a national battle over democracy itself. What began as her simple effort to help neighbors register to vote grew into the exposure of Operation Eclipse, a vast 12-state conspiracy led by billionaire Franklin Cade. This network, intertwined with local law enforcement, private contractors, and political operatives, was designed to make civic participation more difficult, more costly, and more frightening for millions of Black Americans. It was not Clara's strength alone that changed the course of events, but the way her quiet defiance inspired others to act. Her son, Colonel Elias Johnson, put his military career on the line to investigate the shadowy network threatening his mother and countless others. With the assistance of allies like Captain Layla Brooks, Agent Naomi Cho, journalist Maria Santiago, and federal prosecutor Vanessa Green, they uncovered the full extent of Cade's machine, from shell companies funding targeted harassment to data-driven tactics that eroded public trust and chipped away at voter confidence. These revelations fueled mass demonstrations across Atlanta and Savannah, not of anger but of collective resolve, where ordinary people gathered in peaceful solidarity, singing, marching, and refusing to let fear dictate their future. Justice eventually arrived in the form of federal indictments, congressional hearings, and a wave of reforms aimed at protecting voting rights and ensuring accountability for those who sought to suppress them. Clara, her strength restored, transformed her experience into something enduring. The Johnson Center for Civic Empowerment, a national initiative that trains community leaders, provides free legal support, and sends brightly painted buses into neglected neighborhoods to register and educate voters. Elias, having left his military post, now uses his expertise to protect communities from disinformation and digital manipulation, ensuring that the tools once used to silence them now serve to defend them instead. Their story, while rooted in one city and one family, became a national call to action. It reminded Americans that democracy is not an unmovable monument but a living, breathing covenant that demands vigilance and courage to uphold. Clara's voice, once soft and contained within the walls of her library, became a guiding echo for countless others. Every voice, every vote, every future. Her journey proves that even those who never sought the spotlight can change the course of history when they refuse to back down. The lesson here extends far beyond Savannah. In a time when many feel isolated or powerless, Clara's story reminds us that the most powerful resistance often begins with a single act of service, a conversation with a neighbor, a willingness to speak up even when it feels risky. It teaches us that true strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers until enough people listen. And it challenges each of us to consider our own roles in preserving the rights and freedoms that generations before us fought to secure. Whether by casting a ballot, volunteering, amplifying the truth, or simply refusing to look away, we each have the ability to be the voice that tips the balance toward justice. If Clara Johnson's story has inspired you, if it has reminded you why these struggles matter and how much power lies in unity, make sure you don't miss what comes next. Subscribe to our channel today and join a growing community of people committed to justice, truth, and equality. Your support enables us to bring more stories like this to light. Stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us all that democracy only thrives when we all stand to protect it. Tools.